Hello and welcome. It's the Happy Families podcast with me, Dr. Justin Coulson, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. There's been turmoil and upheaval right around the world, and today I'm joined by Luke and Susie, a husband and wife radio duo. They've got 3 kids of their own, and we're going to be talking about all of the turmoil that's been going on.
Dr. Justin, we're raising rebels. I would have thought that would be the opposite to what you're teaching us how to do.
We've had so much going on globally in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, the African-American man who had a police officer kneeling on his neck for something like 9 minutes before he passed away saying, "I can't breathe." This has created a firestorm of protest and controversy and rioting and looting, certainly in the United States, but it's come to Australia. It's been a global thing, and I've had so many parents saying, well, how do I talk to my kids about it, and what do I do? I had several parents who were saying, well, you know, I've got teenagers and they wanted to show up to the protests that were held in capital cities around Australia over the last weekend, and I thought, this is a vexing situation for parents to be in.
Well, in particular, because for months I've been talking to my 11-year-old in particular about social distancing and the importance of doing the right thing and actually looking after others and caring for those in our community by not spreading this unnecessarily. Like, that's been what I've been drilling into him. And then there's these crowds of 10 and 20,000 people that aren't social distancing. And so there's this inconsistency. So how do I have this conversation? Because I want my son to stand up for those who don't have a voice and to be a part of making change. But this is a debate where people had different opinions. And I don't want to just say, well, this is what you have to believe. But I want to equip him to be able to explore these significant angles of what's going on.
I think about rebellion and how people respond to it generally. What I've found is that for the most part, there's a strong desire to shut it down. Force creates resistance. You've heard me say it again and again. And it's kind of interesting when we're looking at what it means to be a good citizen right now, where we've got coronavirus and this need for physical distancing. That's what it means to be a good citizen. But there are many people who feel that to be a good citizen right now means to go out and protest and to call for equal rights, to create an environment where everybody feels safe, and those who may have been marginalised, no, those who have been marginalised actually know that their lives do matter. I was really inspired, actually, by 3 rebel girls in Detroit in the United States. They were 15, 16 and 17 years of age. Their names are Angel, Ariana and Mary. And they were sending some text messages to one another about everything that had gone on. Next thing you know, they became the organisers of a more than 1,000 strong march that went through their local suburbs. It wasn't an inner city thing, it was an outer suburbs thing. And these teen girls who are rebels sort of turned their frustration with the status quo into a 1,000 strong voice for change. But I think there's a really important difference here, Luke and Susie, between being a reflexive rebel and a reflective rebel. And this is what I talked about in my TED talk a couple of years ago in Melbourne. A reflexive rebel is the, you can't tell me what to do, it's my life kind of rebel. It's the stereotypical teenage rebel without a cause. Now, it's also worth mentioning that no rebel is truly without a cause. It's just that sometimes we don't know how to find the cause. But that kind of rebellion, if it's not handled carefully, ends up rupturing relationships and causing anger and pain. And I think that's because the focus on the reflexive rebel, you know, it's a reflex action. So the focus for the reflexive rebel is all about myself rather than others and how I'm being affected and how unjust everything is for me. So in some families, being a reflexive rebel might lead to getting grounded. You know what I mean? In the workplace, it might lead to being, it might lead to being fired. But in the community, being a reflexive rebel, I think, leads to the riots and the looting that we've seen. Whereas a reflective rebel rebels by challenging the status quo, breaking rules constructively, and creating positive changes as a result of that rule breaking. But this is the kind of rebel that chafes at inequality and intolerance and unkindness and rebels against this world that's created injustice. So I think
stand even when no one else is standing with them.
Yeah, that's it. Now the reflective rebel actually encourages perspective and dialogue, whereas the reflexive rebel creates this circumstance that really shuts that down. And it's the reflective rebel. So if we look at it in a workplace, because, you know, rebellion in the workplace has been trendy for a few years now, it's the reflective rebels that are the innovators and the ones that are creating progress and change. And in the community, I think this is where we see the mass social change. So to get back to Luke's question, how do we encourage, because Luke, I'm rephrasing your question, but essentially what I'm hearing you say is, how do we encourage a reflective rather than a reflexive kind of rebel? How do I help my kids to be the kind of kids that know what their values are and stand up for them in the face of adversity to create a better world?
Well, absolutely. And for him to do that, because it's what he believes and what he is reflecting on, and not just because that's what daddy told him. And so, I mean, he's 11, so a lot of what he's going to believe is still based on what we teach. But I'm trying to prepare him for a time when he can think on his own, right? And where does that start? Does that start in these moments?
Yeah, I reckon it does. And I'm just going to give 3 ideas to you that I think will be helpful. The first idea is, and you've heard me say this many, many times, we get curious, not furious. And this is kind of the same as with my 3 E's. This is the explore step. It's where we see a child who wants to rebel or who is confused because there's now this situation that they're confronted with where they're thinking, well, do I or don't I? Do I step in? Do I make a noise? Do I step out? And what we do is instead of telling them what we think, we lean in, avoid the lecture, and instead say, you seem to feel really strongly about this, or you seem to be really confused about this. We let them make up their own minds. So let's say we've got a child who says, I want to go to the protests. I hate what's going on. Did you see that video? I can't believe that it's happened. And they're really emotional about it. And we might say, I did see the video. It really made me stop and think about how awful some people can be in the world. What was it that really irritated you? Tell me why you feel so strongly. And so we're going to give them the opportunity to share with us rather than us telling them how to feel and what to do. The second step is that we want to actually teach our kids how to think. Now, again, if we look at the 3 E's, this is essentially the explain step. So we might need to offer some really wise counsel. If we've got a child that says, I saw what happened and I'm joining the protests and I'm going to go and smash the windows in the mall and I'm going to go and riot, I'm going to go and loot. And we might say, well, I have some ideas that might be helpful if you're planning on going and protesting. Can I share them with you? And what you might do is instead of explaining your perspective, imagine if you ask them questions to invite them to consider alternative views. Like, I know that you want to protest and I know that you want to be aggressive in the protest because you're so emotional. But how might that decision be seen by me or by the law or by your friends? And what might the outcomes be in terms of safety or health or relationships? So what we're actually doing when we ask these questions is we're not moralizing. We're helping them to develop an understanding.
Yeah.
And then the third one is that we empower. And you know this. You've heard me talk about it a million times. Our child's been heard. We've explored appropriate boundaries and limits. We've collaborated on what it might look like. And then we say, well, where to from here? Or how can I help?
It strikes me that what you've just walked through is so beautifully wise, but so painfully rare in our current world, or seemingly so. And I think about Drew Brees, the NFL quarterback, who stated that he thought it was offensive for people taking a knee and offensive to the flag. And he had grandparents who served in the military. And on the back of his opinion that was stated, there was a lot of public backlash from some of his teammates, but also from anybody and everybody in the public. And they talked about getting death threats and getting aggression. And then Drew Brees and his wife came out and they changed their mind. Because these guys inspired me by the fact that on the back of the backlash, they could have easily blocked out the aggression and the anger and the reflexive rebels that were actually giving them the hardest time. But instead, they stopped and they had conversations and they talked to his teammates who were of color and said, explain to me why what I said has triggered such pain. And they did. And they came out and through tears, he and his wife said, we've changed. We understand stuff now that we never understood when we made that statement a couple of days ago. And it was just such a breath of fresh air. And they've copped criticism for changing. And now that the hate's coming from the other side of the debate. But I was so inspired by people who were willing to listen to the opposite opinion that was angry that they could have easily shut out and then asked some questions rather than purely made statements. Everything that you've just walked us through was what they seemingly did in this situation.
When we lean in and get curious, not furious, we may actually not change our mind from time to time, but every now and again, maybe we will. Maybe we'll say, wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. Or, wow, I can see why you feel so strongly. Or, okay, if this is what you're going to choose to do, I won't stand in your way. But can we talk about ways that you can be safe and healthy while you're involved in it? As parents, our job is not to, especially once they become teenagers, not to own, we don't own our children. It's not our job to dominate them. Our job is to support their autonomy so that they can become reflective people of depth. And I can't help but think, Luke and Susie, that if we sit down and have these kinds of conversations with our children, they're going to be far more effective in describing and articulating what it is they believe. They'll work out what their values are because we're having these conversations with them. I get so frustrated when I see people at a protest. The interviewer says, so, why are you here? And they're like, we want justice. Well, tell me more about that. And they've got nothing left. All they've got is that 3-word slogan. I love it when I hear somebody who's articulate and who can say, I'm here because of this and this and this and this. And by the way, here's the evidence and here's that. And we get our children to that point by inviting them to understand all the perspectives and work out safe, healthy ways for them to proceed with what they believe because they actually believe it and not just because it's trendy or somebody else is doing it.
We really appreciate you having this conversation with us, and the idea of raising children who understand what they think, what they believe, and then can articulate that. It feels incredibly empowering and powerful for the next generation. Dr. Justin Coulson, Thanks so much for your time.
If you've enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, could you please do something for me? Pop into Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and a review. Your reviews help other people to find the podcast and make their families happier. Received this review that came through from Starry624. 5 stars, highly recommended. As an early childhood teacher, I have no hesitation in recommending Dr. Justin Coulson to families for caring, practical parenting support and advice. As a father of 6, he has practical experiences with all ages and he keeps it real, in inverted commas. Well, thank you so much, Starry624. Your recommendation and review made my day, and hopefully it'll help other families to find the podcast and make their families happier as well. For more information on how I can help, visit happyfamilies.com.au, or you can visit my Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families.